Let's review the points per game function. First, note that in order to run this code in Wing rather than on your PCRS login, you'll need to include this line from typing import text.io and list in order for your type contract to work. Another thing that we have here that you don't see in your PCRS is an example. Generally, we don't include examples when we write functions that take open files. However, I've included this one here so that you have an example of how you might test your code in the shell. So let's move on to taking a look at what you need to do to complete this function. So the code you had in PCRS has 7 places with a to-do item indicating that you need to fill in the code for that particular line. The order you do this in is really up to you. You may find it easier to look at particular examples. So for example, initializing some integer accumulators could be a straightforward place to start. You can start at any point in the file. I'm going to work top to bottom just because to do it in one ordered way. However, if you find it easier to think about solving this problem in a different kind of order, that is totally okay. Just note that because of the way we have given you this problem, with all these to-dos to fill in, you won't be able to run your code until you've made it so that this code runs without error. So just for an example, if I click run right now, I won't be able to test the code at all because I get a syntax error. So we'll need to make sure our file runs without syntax errors before we can test it. So the first line that we're asked to complete says, due to the structure of the file, line contains a team name. If we look at where line was created, just above here, the first time we go into the loop, we can see that line is set to refer to a line from game data. Based on where we are here, this is the very first line, read in, and with all white space removed. So what that means is we can actually set our team name to be just line. Line is the very first, at the first point through this loop, line refers to the very first line in the file, which will be a team name. We'll also see, based on where this is, that this is our inner loop here. It's going to read through the numbers for each of the teams. So even when we come back around to the loop another time, we'll expect that line refers to a team name. Next, let's set up our accumulator variables. Our accumulator variables are both going to keep track of a number of games played. You can actually see here, we add 1 to games played, and the total number of points. As a reminder about the file format, the non-team name lines all contain integers. So I'm going to initialize my 2 accumulator variables to be ints. While we're thinking about the accumulator variables, let's just jump down here to this line and add our total points, complete that line. We want to add to that the integer representation of each line in the file. So this will be int line. Another thing we can notice is that before we go in to the inner while loop, so we have our team name, which is the last line we read, we'd like to read in the next line in the file. And so the next line in the file can be read in the same way as the other ones, using gamedata.readline.strip. In fact, at this point, you may notice there's another read of a line here, and we can use the same thing in both cases. The only thing that remains to be done now is to think about our while loop condition. You may think about while loop conditions in the same way I do, which is to first think about when do we want to stop? When do we want our while loop to stop? In this case, we want our while loop, the inner one, that reads the points, to stop when it encounters a team name or when we reach the end of the file. So we want this while loop to stop on a team name or end of file, which means that we want it to continue on points. So these are digits in the file. So if we read this line, that was the last line we read, we would want this while loop condition to be false. If it was this line, we'd want it to be true. If it was this line, we'd want false, and this line we'd want false. So we can write up a while loop condition here that takes into account both not a team name, so digits, and the end of the file. So we can say while line is not equal to the empty string, which is the same condition we have up here, which checks for the end of the file. And we want to continue while line.isDigit. That means we want to continue reading our file within this inner loop that adds up points as long as the line we're looking at can be converted to an integer. Let's test this code out now. I'm going to save my file, and I'm going to run this particular example that I happen to have in my docstring. One thing to note about my example is it's making use of an nhldata.txt file. I happen to have that file, and it's in the exact same location as this Py file. I can tell that by looking at the very top of my Wing 101. You can see that this is stored in a 108 folder, and then lectures, week 7, and a folder called worksheet code. If I click on my nhldata.txt file, I can see the same information. It's also in lectures, week 7, worksheet code. We can test out our function by copying and pasting the parts of this example into the Python shell. So let's start by running our file. This time, it ran without any errors. So I see evaluategamedata.py down here. I'm going to copy this line for the input file. This runs. If you try to run this line and you get an error saying file not found, make sure your Python code and your text file are in the same folder. Now I'll copy the call to the function, and it returns this following list. If you look at the example, this list is what we expect. It's one list with 3 inner lists: Toronto Maple Leafs with a value of 1.17, Grand Prairie Storm with a value of none, and Montreal Canadiens with a value of 1.2. One last thing before we finish, we want to make sure we close our input file to tidy up our open files.